Welcome, everyone. This panel, just to remind you all, is called The Act of War, The Impact on the People Who Have to Fight. I have three wonderful, wonderful writers with me here today. I'm very, very excited for this panel, and I think it should be a particularly interesting, particularly good one. My name is Ziyanda Stuurman. Back in 2021, I wrote a book on policing in South Africa. And in a second, we'll talk about some of the common themes, some of the common experiences, and definitely the writers' perspectives as they wrote each of these books. So I'm going to do a quick introduction of each of the writers, and then I'm going to read a little bit from the book jackets of each of them, given that most of the books are hot off the press, quite fresh off the press. Let me start on my furthest left here with Andrew Brown. He is an advocate and a sergeant in the SAPS Reservists, as well as a police liaison officer for the Child Protection Unit at Red Cross Children's Hospital. He is the author of 2 non-fiction books and 5 novels, including Cold Sleep Lullaby, winner of the Sunday Times Prize for Fiction in 2006, and Refuge, which was shortlisted for the Commonwealth Writers' Prize for Literature in 2009. Andrew has 3 children, and he lives right here in Cape Town. Let me move on to Farai, who's right in the middle. Farai Mudzingwa is a Zimbabwean writer whose fiction is influenced by music, our interior selves, and alternate realities. He has recently previously published a short fiction, Green Shadows in the Kia Kia Republic, and short stories in Weaver Press anthologies. His profiles, literature reviews, and political essays have appeared in New Frame, Chimurenga Chronic, The Africa Report, New Humanitarian, TRT News, Contemporary, and Mail and Guardian. And Craig Higginson is an award-winning author and playwright who is based in Johannesburg, for all of his sins. The Ghost of Sam Webster is his most haunting and ambitious novel to date, drawing together the epic historical sweep and state-of-the-nation resonance and the dramatic psychological complexity of his prize-winning and celebrated novels, The Landscape Painter, The Dream House, and The Book of Gifts, which I'm sure you've all read. So I'm just going to very quickly read the blurbs on each book, just so we can situate ourselves in the conversation. Andrew's book is called The Bitterness of Olives. And I do want to say here, the reason why I don't have multiple tags is I read these books in PDF copy. Okay, so it's not like I didn't read them. Thanks, everyone. I just want to put that out there. The blurb for this book, Avi Dahan, a retired detective mourning his beloved wife in Tel Aviv, and Khalid Mansour, a Palestinian doctor confronting the precarious reality of living in Gaza City, are still reeling from the political fallout that jeopardized their delicate friendship. When a mysterious corpse, scarred by history and forbidden love, shows up in Khalid's emergency room, he reaches out to Avi for help. Though the detective is the only one who might be able to assist, he is the last person on earth to agree. ... Farai's wonderful book is called Avenues by Train. Here we go. So when 7-year-old Jedza witnesses a tragic incident involving a train and the death of his close boyhood friend in his hometown of Miners Drift, he is convinced that his life is haunted. Now in his mid-20s, Jedza is a down-and-out electrician moving to Harare in the hopes that he will escape the darkness and superstitions of the small town. But in the shadowy, restless atmosphere of the avenues, with its mysterious pools of water rising under musasa trees, he is tormented by the disappearance of his sister and their early encounters with ancestral spirits, the shifting power of the Njuzu, and a vengeful Ngozi. To move forward, he must stop running away and confront the trauma of his past. And Craig's wonderful book, The Ghost of Sam Webster. Here we go. Writer Daniel Hawthorne is packing up his mother's house in Johannesburg when he hears about the disappearance of Sam Webster, the beautiful daughter of his friend, the famous historian Bruce Webster. When the body of Sam appears briefly on the banks of the flooded Buffalo River, Daniel decides to visit the Webster's luxury lodge in the heart of Zululand. Under the guise of researching a new novel about his disgraced ancestor, the lepidopodist, Lieutenant Charles Hawthorne, who fought in the Battle of Isandlwana, Daniel starts to investigate the reasons for Sam's disappearance. The lines between loyalty and betrayal, love and hate, cowardice and courage, redemption and shame soon become blurred as Daniel gets closer to the truth. Okay, so everybody is going to buy at least one copy of each of the books. Okay, so I think starting with Andrew and coming back in this direction, what I really want to ask, I could ask all of you, where were you when you came up with the idea of the book, but no one wants to hear that. So I'm going to go a little bit deeper and ask this question. In all three of your books, the characters in them go through a process of excavation, revisiting or reliving past events and traumas, and confronting who they are today. How much of that do each of you share with your characters, or what did you have to revisit, unpack, or confront in the process of writing these stories? Andrew?
Sure. No foreplay, I see.
No, Dan, let's get to it.
Okay. I think writing is inevitably a process of one's own discovery and one's own coming to terms with your own traumas and coming to terms with the traumas that you are reading about when you research the topic. So for me, when I wrote in Yenzi about the genocide in Rwanda, it was very, very much me trying to come to terms with something that I absolutely did not and could not understand. I'm not sure writing the book made a big difference to my understanding, but it was a process of healing, I suppose. I wrote a book called Devil's Harvest about South Sudan, and that was also for me a process of coming to terms with what I had thought was a euphoric, beautiful change in political landscape in Sudan. So South Sudan had been part of the country of Sudan, had been in civil war for years and years, and they decided to split into north and south. And in my naivety, I thought that was a brilliant idea and was going to solve all these problems. And I went to South Sudan. I spent a lot of time there. And I just saw unimaginable trauma. It's like ground zero. South Sudan is like ground zero. There's just nothing there that you are used to as a middle-class South African. And it was very hard for me to go through that process. So writing the book was very much for me coming to terms with that. This book is set in Gaza. When I married 30 years ago, I'm Magaid. I converted to Judaism, so I come from a strong Jewish family. My children are Jewish. And Gaza and Palestine and Israel is just a constant thorn. Friday night suppers, do you talk about it or don't you? What has Netanyahu done now? What's happened in Gaza now? It's just a constant issue. And whenever you're in a Jewish circle of friends, do you talk about it? Don't you talk about it? Who is going to have particular views that are going to be offensive to you? Are you never going to talk to this person again if you actually raised it? So, it's there. It's the elephant in the room in many situations. And I think for me, writing this book, hopefully in a balanced way, puts myself out there, puts my views out there, but also allowed me to explore them personally and reach certain personal conclusions as well. So, yeah, to some extent, writing is a selfish occupation. You sort of inflict your own process on others, but hopefully it's not unenjoyable for others, and hopefully others can go along that journey with you as well.
Excellent. Yeah, we spoke a little bit before the panel, so we'll come back to the theme of selflessness, because I think it's a very, really, really interesting one to explore, both in this book and in conversation, for sure. Farai?
Right. The big questions have been reserved for my final panel. There's something that's just occurred to me now as I was thinking about your question. There's a 10-year time period from 1980 to 1990. That's Zimbabwe's first decade of independence. That's when I was born, 79. And it also coincides with my father being alive and dying in that's his last 10 years of life. And there's a very weird thing that started happening to me the closer I got to the age he was, that I remember him as. It's almost like I've been trying to know him now in a way I could not know him when I was 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So I've been thinking there's a long 5, 6, 7, I don't know how long it's been, period where I'm trying to imagine the things he did that I know. It's a good thing his life is recorded. He was a politician. I like to think of him as the last socialist in ZANU-PF before whatever klepto crap is going on. And there are a lot of contrarian things that he did that I've been digging back. So I spent a lot of time in the archives reading actual newspapers, journals, and all of that. And so I've got a body of research that is based on my own personal endeavors, I guess, that I've just been sitting on. And then I decided to fictionalize it, create a couple of characters, and then drag them through that history. So I found myself in the avenues. I was actually living there. And I started thinking, where's this place going to? Because it's a place in flux. I started thinking, where's this place coming from? What has happened here? And I dug up all these things concurrently with the personal research I was doing. There are a lot of national traumas that happened in Zimbabwe Zimbabwe was only colonized for like 90 years. But there have been massive traumas that, like on a national level, that happened there. And they're also personal traumas because what's happening in the nation. It's people going through things. And I just started off in the avenues and just started working back. Like, what have people gone through? When the country was going through a series of wars, people were going through a series of wars, imprisonments, and all of that. And this book, I think, is an attempt to reconcile those things. I realized personally I had a block. I did not remember anything from before my father died. I think death is a trauma. I don't know if it's a big T, small t, but I had to go into the archives to read the newspapers that I read when I was a kid and watch news reports that I saw when I was a kid to jog my memory. And yeah, so I was healing my own trauma and processing traumas through fictional characters.
Yeah. Very grateful for that, in the book and how much history you write as well. I think, we have a broad idea of history in Zimbabwe, but having it be really personal, but also feeling quite real, I think was just a really great part of the book. Craig.
I haven't prepared an answer at all. I keep having different thoughts. It's so hard to know where a book really comes from and when it started. And sometimes things emerge that you didn't know would emerge during the writing process. Sometimes you think you're writing one book and actually there's another sort of shadow book underneath it that sort of emerges and almost takes over. I wrote this book during COVID, during that time. One of the things I did was I listened to Anna Karenina on Audible. I've read that novel several times, but not for a long time. And what I love about that novel is it's really, you kind of feel that Tolstoy wrote that novel because of the character Levin, who's this landowner. And it's kind of Tolstoy in a way, who was actually way ahead of his time. He's kind of a bit of a hippie and a bit of a socialist, vegetarian, pacifist, deeply troubled by the whole kind of landowner. I don't know why I'm talking about Tolstoy, but anyway. But he wrote this book. Really, it's about Levin's sort of evolution. And then there's a kind of a soap opera story about Anna Karenina being unfaithful to her husband. And so that's the thing that sort of makes you turn the pages. But there's this other thing going on, this sort of philosophical investigation going on underneath it. And I remember also watching the second season of The Bridge. I don't know if you guys have watched that. And just sort of thinking, gosh, this is just like a crime thing, but it's as good as Chekhov. It's about what it is to be a human being, like in this most fundamental way. And I sort of felt haggard after, sort of, I don't know, just really moved by it actually, that how you can have quite a, sort of quite a genre thing, and then underneath there's this other thing going on. So I sort of wanted to do a book that did that in a way. And then at the same time, there was someone who was wanting me to write a musical about the Battle of San Luana. Didn't have any money, and obviously, he wanted to do Les Mis with the Battle of San Luana, and I was the guy who was going to do it. And I said to him, no, that's impossible. Just politically, just apart from anything else, just politically, it's just impossible. But he insisted that I went down there, and there was this funny little mountain shaped like the Sphinx in Egypt, surrounded by these sort of homesteads, sort of litter in the streets and goats wandering around. And I thought, what is this place? It sort of seemed quite disappointing. But then you start hearing the stories, and there's this, the cairns, which are these mass graves where the British soldiers were sort of, they were all killed. A few escaped. And the British Army came back several months later and sort of buried them in these mass graves and put these rocks over them. But, Rorke's Drift was supposed to be this wonderful, heroic site of, British nationalist resistance. All these young Zulu soldiers who actually broke off from their command in the right wing of the army and went off and attacked these people across the river. They weren't supposed to do that. A lot of them very young men. Thousands of them lying there, and were just thrown into these mass graves. And a lot of people were still half alive, and they were just killed and dumped in these, and that was against international law, whatever. These sort of atrocities, really, and you're just sort of in this huge graveyard. And then I was very aware of the stories in the early 90s that were going on around Msinga and all of those. And then the more recent murders, obviously people like David Rattray. But there were lots of other stories of murder. And so it just seemed like this incredibly haunted place. So I wanted to write about how our landscape is kind of shadowed by our history, and especially in this country. I mean, I think it's a thing around the world if you dig anywhere. But we are so haunted by our violent past, our colonial past, slavery, but further back. I mean, Zimbabwe's, Southern Rhodesia, all those. It's just war after war after war. Gatling guns just mowing people down. Just slaughter. And when I try to research the Battle of San Luana, I just couldn't get beyond the point where this guy called Charlie Raw and his Basotho horsemen came upon the army, because after that it was just slaughter. And what was the meaning? I mean, what is the meaning of this thing, and why? How do we get to do these things? So I was sort of cogitating on all that, and then Corona happened, and it sort of felt like a very uncertain, scary time where everything was sort of, the world was so estranging, and we felt so estranged. And so I wanted to absorb, I suppose that visit started coming back to me in this Lion Mountain, and I had this image of this girl rolling around in the Buffalo River, this dead girl. And it started sort of coming. So, but obviously when one writes, I think about like what you were saying, it comes from a deep unconscious root. It has to come from a place of deep necessity. Otherwise it doesn't have life in it. And it's an unconscious root. You're not fully conscious or aware of where it's coming from. But it has to, I think, have that deep root for it to really matter in a sort of fundamental way. And then, of course, it became about my own excavation. And so Daniel Hawthorne, the protagonist, I had a little sister who died of leukemia. The book's actually dedicated to her. She was 2 when she got it, and 4, not even 4 when she died. And my mom passed recently, and she had this sort of epilepsy. We had these terrible car accidents when I was a kid. And I remember my dad beating this goose to death with a metal rake, when my sister was in hospital. And all these sort of memories and sort of violent events from my childhood started sort of coming into this character's backstory. And it became a sort of like Tolstoy's book. I mean, I'm not comparing it to Anna Karenina, but all of these things started becoming unearthed, and one gives space to that, and sort of, so it's quite hard to articulate it. It's quite a mysterious evolution, but I think books, when they're powerful, they do come from a deep unconscious root. Yeah.
I would definitely agree with that, and I think there's something really interesting about books holding space, both consciously and unconsciously, and what it means to put that down and put that out there really for the world. Farai and Craig, I wanted to ask both of you about colonialism as this past event, but also process, in the books, but also it being really present in the characters, in the lives of the characters you write about. How and why did you choose to really foreground that, as opposed to, saying we're in modern Zimbabwe, we're in, modern South Africa, let that be that, sort of leave that behind? Why was it important to really bring that into the book in very real ways? Start with Farai.
Can I just start by adding on to what Craig just said when he spoke about the Gatling? I dug in those archives for a bit, and I also believe the Gatling was, it was a monster. You've got people with spears and short, shields from cowhides, and you've got a semi-automatic. This thing had rounds this big, and it's just pumping them, boom, 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 boom. And it wasn't a war. I mean, war is not supposed to be fair, but it wasn't a war. It was a massacre. If you read accounts of those battles, it's 10 BSAP soldiers fighting against 2,000 men, and they're mowing them down, 50, 100, 150, 200 at a time. And the Gatling wasn't even the big thing. The big thing was the Maxim. Because the Gatling would jam. They would fire 15, 20 seconds, and it jams however long it runs. The because it would overheat. And then they came up with the Maxim gun that was water-cooled, and this thing could just go. So you only needed 5 men to fight 2,000 men. And these guys don't know what you're holding. They keep coming at you because they see 5 people, and they just see people just being cut down. So anyway, that's, to get your question, which I think I remember, there's no way I could write about Zimbabwe now. I mean, I could, but I kept asking, but why? Why is, so the setting is, the contemporary setting is the avenues now, which is in the city, right in the center of the city. It's like a Rosebank Killarney copy in Harare. There's no way I could write about that without figuring out how this place came to be. And one of the problems with Zimbabwe, which feature in the novel as well, is the place falls apart because you've got a group of people who are not going anywhere. They keep running the place into the ground, and even when they lose elections, they win them. And one of the reason they stay in power that overrides everything else is because they say we fought for this country, we died for this country. ZANU did not invent that. That's been happening it's now since 130 years. The pioneers, founders, their claim to the country was we fought for it, we bled for it, and then we built it. It's not because they built it, they fought for it, shed blood for it first, and then they built it. That's their claim to, this is our land. Except there'd been wars going on there for 1,000 years. People bleeding and dying for that same land. You just join in 1896. Fair enough, you shed blood, but then you carry on a series of battles and wars where people are shedding blood. So what we have now with the current blokes in power, they're just the latest in a succession of groups of people who have shed blood, and therefore they have current ownership. And one of the wildest things is the opposition in Zimbabwe now, they have that. Whenever there are elections, there's election violence, they actually have credentials. And, ooh, I got jailed for 2 weeks. Ooh, I got beaten, I got this, I got that. They're inheriting these, we shed blood, we suffered for this, which breeds entitlement. Therefore, what comes next? Therefore, I must have this because I suffered. Where was I going with this? The present is always, I have to explain why. Why does the Avenues exist? What came there? And it goes, the Avenues was built, it was literally where they put in the Union Jack. That's where they set up the government, not even government, BSAC offices and all of that. That's all in the setting. What's happening now is just a continuation of what has been happening for 130 years.
Yeah.
That's the short answer.
Yeah. It's, as it says, the present is the past, the personal is political, time is a flat circle. A lot of that. Craig.
Yeah, I mean, mine in a way is a novel about people who narrate history. So it's not really about just unconsciously, just sort of blatantly sort of trying to narrate history. It's so it's a contemporary narrative in a luxury sort of 5-star lodge where there are guides who take you into the battlefields and give you these accounts. And when I went there, I was sort of so struck by this is in the wake of Brexit and everything. All these sort of British people, for example, who are going there to kind of find their national identity, in the middle of nowhere, sort of around this strange rock, sitting, and this is where somehow some sort of idea of Britishness can be sustained and salvaged, which I found very strange. And the sort of narrative that the tour guides are kind of giving now is that we kind of giving the Zulu perspective. That's how they sort of sell it, to kind of make it more, I don't know, like, and I think they genuinely think they are doing the Zulu perspective because they're talking about this chief and things that sort of went on. But how can they possibly be talking about the Zulu perspective? But there was a sort of the style of the narration, and there are lots of lodges. It's not just the Rattray Lodge. There's lots of lodges, and you get these sort of guys. They've got a uniform and sort of wear khaki shorts, a pale blue linen shirt, hat, knob carry, and they stand in these anthills, and they deliver these sort of quite sentimentalized versions, of the battles. I was reminded of Thomas Hobbes, the philosopher, who described laughter as self-applause. And there's something about the narration of these stories. There's a kind of level of self-applause that sort of goes on. I'm not trying to be horrible about these guys, but I just think it's an interesting thing to sort of investigate and explore. So my narrator, my protagonist is going into this space wanting to write about his ancestor, but I mean, there is a guy called Walter Higginson who's no known relative, but I haven't, investigated too deeply, but who's notorious for being a coward in the Battle of Asandlwana. So you have these historical accounts where, you have, Melville and Kogel who rescued the colours and, took them across and then got drowned in the river, and they got sort of murdered on the other side, and they get Victoria Crosses posthumously. In and amongst there was this guy called Higginson who was also helped sort of with the colours. He was a better swimmer. He got to the other end, and then he kind of went off to get a horse apparently, while the other two got killed. And whether he saw them being killed and ran away on the horse or quite what happened, no one seems to know, because they were either dead or But I was just sort of interested how some characters are sort of chosen for heroism and some characters are chosen, and it's just not like that. There were certain, when you read about Higginson, sometimes he held his position longer than others and then retreated, and others he went back earlier than others. And this was sort of 25,000 Zulu soldiers attacking a few thousand, some of them injured, sort of people in this camp. They were running away all day. So how one was running away and one wasn't, I'm just not quite sure. So I just wanted to problematize all this and sort of write a narrative about this famous battle, but from the point of someone who'd been disgraced. I just thought that was more kind of interesting. And there were a lot of things that emerged during my search. There's a guy who's written a lot of books about the Battle of Asandlwana who I spoke to. And two of the things that I sort of emerged was there was a lot of the whipping that went on was so extreme that it was actually outlawed as a practice by the British Parliament after the battle. And the other thing was the homosexual relationships that were happening in the army, that the guy took over after Lord Chelmsford, because Chelmsford sort of lost his job after Asandlwana because they thought he wasn't very good at this. He said that the soldiers were leaving their wives rather than sort of going back to their wives. So some of the sort of more contemporary kind of information that was sort of filtering through that hadn't really been written about in the official narrative sort of found their way in. And I think we're constantly retelling stories from the past in order to make different kind of sense of the present. Obviously we can't tell the truth about the past because it's the past and we can't really access it. We're creating fictions. But I think we've got to keep re-examining our past to try and understand where we're at and measuring ourselves against it. And, our history is part of who we are. And this is a novel about the past intruding into the present in a very profound way. So the past had to be represented in some sort of way as well and given some sort of space within the narrative.
Yeah. And I thought it was, ingenious really to write a book about war and to really then thread, the idea of cowardice and disgrace, given that war is a big sort of banner, immediately conjures these images of sacrifice, heroism, bravery, and to complicate that, as you say, and put that into an even more complicated perspective, I thought was done incredibly well. Andrew, so you're a police reservist, and you've written 2 non-fiction books about policing, police officers, and the police system in post-apartheid South Africa, and both of which, the titles, have the phrase reluctant policeman in their title. Just to refresh your memory, Andrew's 2 books on policing are Good Cop, Bad Cop, and Street Blues. Did you find that writing Avi's story in this book was a sort of cathartic or unpacking or opening process, either for your own experiences, in South Africa, and again, having done so for 25 years, if I'm not mistaken, or a process really of unpacking for any of your other officers or fellow reservists?
I think writing the non-fiction for me was very much a cathartic experience, writing the stories about policing. I wrote Street Blues because I thought it would be easy. I'd struggled with a novel. I wanted to write something easy. I thought the easiest thing must be to write about what you know and write about yourself. So I sat down and started writing short stories that became Street Blues. And actually, it's impossibly hard. Every sentence feels kind of either self-deprecating or self-congratulatory, and every word makes you cringe. And then there's all the thing about what do you say, what do you include, what do you not include, how are you portraying yourself. It's actually a completely impossible process. I can't believe I did it a second time. But that was truly cathartic. I mean, the Street Blues was about, for me, was about why policemen and women end up as alcoholics, end up with stress, end up cracking. And I think it's the punchline, if you like, of Street Blues for me was that it's not the big traumas. It's the little, everyday, constant, grinding traumas. Seeing other people's misery every single day eventually gets to you. The big traumas you see coming, you maybe have counseling, you talk about, you get over. But in fact, in Street Blues, it was a car accident where a young girl died, hit by a bus in her little car. And 3 of my constables cracked. I cracked. And 3 of them cracked without even seeing her body. They just saw her driver's license, and it was the last tipping point. So yeah, Street Blues was very much a cathartic exercise. This book, yes, to some extent. Avi is, for me, a complex character who's dealing with the recent death of his wife, what it means to have lived a life with a single person and then lose her. I was married for 28 years and then divorced. And it was a shock to me that you could live your whole life with one person and then suddenly not be with them anymore for whatever reason. And I think that part of it was me coming to terms with that there is a second life that then must happen. And for Avi, as a character, it's incredibly hard for him. He feels old. He feels like he's finished. And at one point in the book, he says he fights with his son, Reuben, the whole time about Israel. So Reuben has grown up in Israel, had to go to the army because you have to in Israel, is angry with his father for allowing him to go to the army. And the moment he's out of the army, he leaves. And he goes to New York, becomes a lawyer, and refuses to return. and he has these tense, horrid conversations with his father, and his father can only remember those conversations, so he's forgotten the love of bringing up a son, and he only has these conversations. So Avi, in the book, it's a coming to terms with who he is in Israel. What has he become? What has he contributed to? And finding a second reason for living. And right in the end, I believe that he, through a lot of pain and a lot of trauma, I think he reaches that position. So I think there's that part of the catharsis for me. I don't think it's very evident and very close, but that was the process that I was going through.
Yeah. And I mean, I think the writing in this book, the writing in Good Cop and Street Blues, is so necessary for really understanding what a police institution is, and the fact that individuals within that are not a system; they're people too.
Yeah.
So I thought that was really well put forward. Farai, reading your book, I must say, felt like a multimedia experience for me. You were so good at weaving music, culture, and spirituality into the pages of the book, and into so much of the story. How much of the connection with Shona, music and spirituality were you intentional about writing into the story? And what do you hope the book reveals to its readers about Shona culture?
That's exactly what I was trying to do.
Excellent. It worked.
Well done.
The music is, I think I write because I never got the chance. And even when I've dabbled in music, I've got a very horrible voice. We had mandatory, I went to a boys' Catholic boarding school when I was 12. Choir was mandatory. We all the Form 1s lined up. You sing 3, 4 at a time. I was out straight. I would feel pain in I don't know, this little lumpy throat, and I thought it felt nice and warm, and I thought I was singing well. I was croaking, and yeah. There's something I wanted to do with this book, which is a parallel to. There are a lot of references to Mbira music. There's a musician, his name is Thomas Mafumo, and I hope I don't mangle this. Hugh Tracy is a prominent ethnomusicologist here. What he did was, I mean, he did a lot of other things, but the main thing he did was go around communities, African communities, and collect music and essentialize it as in an anthropological way. This is what the native does. In the morning, he wakes up his children, he goes to the fields, he comes back, he plays his mbira, and then he does this, he plays a drum, and his collection has been challenged by a number of people, Zimbabwean historians, who say this guy just went to villages, got the most mediocre music from the most random people, and essentialized Shona music as that. And listening to it, the whole Ilam library, I get what they're saying. And the problem with that is not, it's a good archive. I source anthropological archives a lot, ethnological music archives a lot. A lot of what I know about Mbira is from Paul Bellina and Michael Gelfand, even my own culture. There's a lot of things that are lost. Anthropological archives and ethnological music are brilliant. However, the problem with them is they essentialize the African, the native, as this being that's stuck in the past who has a certain way of doing things and does not evolve. And the sponsoring of these archives in the colonial era was designed to do just that. We were not allowed to evolve. And what Thomas Mafumo did and a bunch of his band members and a number of other musicians, they took the tradition of Mbira music and they modernized it, they transposed it onto guitars, drums. So they took the Mbira rhythm. It's a polyrhythmic instrument. That one I can play somewhat mediocrely, but you play it, you hear 2, 3, it's only got 22 keys. You hear 2, 3 melodies, they start interweaving, you start hearing almost phantom melodies going in. It sounds like 3 people, 4 people, you can't tell how many people are playing it. He took a bunch of music, and they've been doing this since the 1950s. The same time that Hugh Tracy was gathering the Africans sitting outside his hut, you had Africans modernizing those same instruments, but they were not allowed to modernize it in the way they wanted to modernize it. The colonial administration said the modern African does this, the rural native does this. So that whole modernizing of the mbira, which is an essential instrument in Shona culture, did not exist in the music archive of the African in Rhodesia. And Mafumo did that, and his musicians, and they modernized it, and their music really took off. It had a concurrent emergence with the nationalist movement, and it really took off during the war and after the war. Very ambitious, but I was trying to do the same thing in the book. Take Shona storytelling and put it in the form of a book, English literature, which is a foreign medium for me. I'm used to oral storytelling. That's why there's a lot of musicality, a lot of oral. The dialogue we tell stories in our dialogue, and that's what I was trying to do with the book. Take the medium, take our spirituality or music, and tell our story, the story of, fictionalized story of this lost musicality, lost spirituality, lost culture through the medium of fiction. They're griots. Mafumo himself is a griot. The mbira players are griots. When we have these ceremonies that are spread throughout the book, they are a way of summoning a communal consciousness of the people. That's what I believe ancestors are. It's like a moving consciousness of the community that you're in. That's why they're village ancestors, communal, district sort of ancestors, and their national ancestors, the great ancestors that drove the anti-colonial war. All these rituals, all these ceremonies, all these musical, and they're not performances, they're participatory gatherings. We don't perform. You don't play the mbira for people. You play with people. All of that, the storytelling, you don't tell stories to people. We share stories. That's what this is. And that's why it was also essential for me to get a publisher who understood that. I'm not writing an English literature book. I'm not writing an English novel. I'm telling a Shona story using English novel medium. The dialogue, and you have to assume that I assumed the reader's intelligence. And I would like the reader to trust me that I assume their intelligence. And I would like the reader to also trust me and assume my intelligence. So when you read it, put aside Dickens, put aside Shakespeare, Hardy, who I all love, Dostoevsky, put that aside. Trust that if you don't understand why the sentence says, I want to bite your ears, don't say, what kind of English is this? It is written in that way. It's a literal but, metaphoric, but you will get it in context. You understand what I'm saying. You will feel the meaning in what I'm, just trust that I trust you to trust me. And you will, you'll get what is happening in there.
I love that.
Thank you.
Aren't you guys glad you chose this panel, huh? Okay, so we have about 15 minutes, and I definitely want to open it up to the audience for questions. Farai, I know you had a little bit of reading you wanted to do. Can I ask that we leave that for right at the end? Is that okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, always good to leave people with a bit of a morsel. We have roving mics, I think. Yes, there we go. So if anybody has any questions, now's the time. There we go. Oh, and please tell us your name. That would be nice. This is a conversation.
My name is It's Alexis. You all in some way talk about catharsis and your relation to the story and the catharsis of it, whether in every different kind of war dynamic, especially with violence, if you're coming to it. But then there's also this thing of the narrative structure of it and the kind of, I only really studied it with film, but the use of war films as just to completely manipulate people. And then I don't know if you remember The Thin Red Line, where everybody just was obliterated. And it was such a good film because it was just, you didn't have a beginning, middle, and end. You just arrived and died, and everyone was finished. You know? So how do you take that sense of responsibility with you when you go into a story like that? How do you take the narrative structure when a beginning, middle, and end will leave everybody having gotten over the stuff you brought up with a proper message?
Maybe I can try and stab at an answer on that. We were discussing that kind of thing in a previous session today about responsibility when you are writing these stories. And one of the things that interests me is the extent to which very little fiction comes out of conflict zones. A lot of non-fiction comes out of conflict zones. So my first book was about Rwanda and the genocide. And what interested me there was that there were lots of books, but they were all personal accounts of things that had happened. And so that sort of partly answers your question that if you're writing about yourself, then the beginning, the middle, and the end is what happened to me. It's not what happened in the war, or, you know. If you're a historian, obviously, writing non-fiction, then I think it's expected of you to write the tome on the war in Rwanda or whatever it is. If you're writing fiction, I think that there are different dynamics at play. First of all, there's responsibility. So how do you present? I'm not, I wasn't a participant in the war. Farai, I don't think was a participant in the war either. Craig wasn't a participant at Sandwana. How do we write about it responsibly, with integrity, when we weren't there and we're not participants and we don't have the trauma? And I do think it's possible, and I do think that we must. Someone in the last session, actually from the audience, made a very good point. She said, it enables you to humanize the history, humanize the conflict in a way that then makes it more accessible for people. And also, to pick up on a point that Craig made, it also allows you to, I don't know if the right word is modernize it, but bring it into contemporary sensibilities. If you read a historical novel that was written 100 years ago, you're going to find quite a lot of it to be insensitive and lacking in contemporary sensibilities. So writing fiction, I think, does allow you to modernize it in that sense. How you end it, I think you have to be reliant on your characters and not try and end it in a way that's going to make historical sense. The Gaza conflict, I think it's going to be with us for the next few decades. I don't think it's going to be resolved anytime soon because I don't think there's any will to resolve it. So you can't write a book in which there's any sense of denouement around the conflict itself. So you've got to take your character, and somehow your character's got to reach that point of understanding. So I think it's a bit limited in that sense in terms of what you can say and do with it. But I do think that you can humanize the experience. I don't know if that sort of answers your question.
I think one of the most powerful scenes I've ever seen in a film is in Thin Red Line, that Hans Zimmer music and that misty thing. It's called Journey to the Line. It's a great title for something. It is a journey to a line. It's the most extraordinary film sequence. And I think Thin Red Line is such a brilliant film because it's so much about the interiority. So many, it's all about, war films are so much about action, exterior. We learned from Aristotle that if you want to call someone a courageous person, you must look at their actions, and if they act courageously, they are a brave person. If they act in a cowardly way, they are a cowardly person. And you know, these action movies, you know, that's a genre. So I'm very much writing against that. I mean, mine's all about interiority. And I mean, I wrote a novel called The Landscape Painter, where characters sort of, but I keep talking about Tolstoy. I'm really not trying to compare myself to him. But what I loved about War and Peace was the way the character just sort of stumbles into the Napoleonic Wars, doesn't know what the hell's going on, and stumbles out again. And I try to do that in The Landscape Painter, where my character sort of stumbles in, and the war carries on after the novel's finished. You know, in catharsis, yeah, I mean, catharsis is very problematic. I mean, as Brecht picked up, you know, and Brecht did his theatre of alienation to work against catharsis. And for me, you know, you can see it in Macbeth. You can see in lots of previous things before Brecht where writers use a mixture of catharsis and alienation. And I think we use this all the time. So there are times when we want the reader or the audience to be with us. So when the protagonist cries, we cry. When they laugh, we laugh. And then they put in a Donald Trump, and when he cries, we laugh, and when he laughs, we cry. That's a Brechtian hero. And writers are using these techniques all the time of catharsis, of empathy, and then of alienation to provoke a response in the reader, to make them angry, to make them upset that problems of the world haven't been solved inside the artwork. Do you know what I mean? And so I'm very conscious of using catharsis and alienation as devices all the time. I'm certainly, hopefully, not glamorizing war in any sort of way. I mean, I'm really writing a sort of anti-war novel. I mean, yes, I haven't been in a war, but I also have. You know, I was born into what was then called Rhodesia in the middle of a civil war, and my father was fighting, my uncle was fighting, and the neighbors were murdered at my granny's house. And one of my earliest memories is of driving in convoy through the bush and sort of being frightened of these people behind the acacia trees, like this little kid. You know, so, and then we left Zimbabwe in '76 to arrive in Johannesburg around June '76. You know, so from the frying pan into the fire. So, I mean, my call-up papers came at the end of '89, and there's no way I was going to participate in that. And so, yeah, so I mean, we live in a state of, I mean, Corona was like a war. You know, you were in this frightening place, and people were dying, people just were disappearing, and it felt like a war. It felt like a war, and I think I took that feeling into that war, and then sort of trying to make sense of something that makes no sense, I think is a task of fiction, and that's why we write, and we read, and we write in order to experience the world from places that our everyday lives don't afford us. So as writers, we have to write about things that we don't live. And as readers, that's why we read. You know, why would we just want to read about ourselves? It's a sort of narcissistic thing. You know, we want to be stretched. We want our empathy extended, and that's why we write, and that's why we read. Thank you.
Excellent. Okay, yes.
It's a lovely feeling when your responses to the previous question lead nicely into the question I was preparing. Yeah, absolutely. I work as like a history tour guide around the city, which is a lovely job because you're always kind of engaging with people know and don't know, and you're always reading from history. And I wanted to pick up on what Craig was saying about how there's that industry of people going to Santwana from Britain to get a sense of their base in history and that. And like that's an obvious thing, but then I'm reading a book now about Mafeking, the siege of Mafeking. And I didn't know this, but the biggest impromptu celebration in London's history was on Mafeking night in May 1900, when thousands of people just stormed the streets because the town of Mafeking, Mahikeng today, was relieved. Now that's completely forgotten, like not only in Britain but here, like at a fundamental level. And it's because history is politicized. It's because the only reason why we end up telling history stories often is to support a political narrative or something today. And it's so annoying to people like us, I'm sure, who love it at a literary value of like telling stories and understanding human experience. So have you guys written your books in some way to like kind of depoliticize historical war stories, or is it kind of trying to reflect on the breadth of that experience or that history? Or
I mean, I won't answer for long because I want to let you guys speak. But I just want to make clear, I'm not judging the people from Britain who are coming. I understand that people want a sense of history, context, continuity. I don't want to judge that. You know, who am I to judge that? You know, I have no idea about their thing. But everything is political, so I'm certainly not trying to depoliticize anything. And everything, you know, we're all coming from our own context. And it's always politically charged. There's some political positions that are maybe more easily justified than others, but yeah, you guys respond.
Yeah, everything is political. And I think, as I was just thinking about this Sandalwana, I don't know if we've got a marked battlefield like that in Zimbabwe, but what I do write about is there's a, I don't know if it's a paradox or, I don't know, there's a word I'm looking for. It could be paradox, might work. Where they're still there, these sacred places, which were denigrated as, oh, this is this pagan, heathen, witchcraft things that these natives are doing. And yet, the people, Rhodes and them came, and he's buried at the most sacred place. So he knew exactly what he was doing. Rhodes is buried, I don't know who knows where it's the most scenic amphitheater you will ever see. It's like the Drakensberg with a different type of rock formation. And that's where he got buried. And it's the most sacred place where it's a regional, it's not even a Zimbabwe place, it's a regional place. From Botswana, what's now Botswana, Zambia, Mozambique, Limpopo, all the way up to Malawi. And in the month of November, there are no marriages, there are no ceremonies of any sort in that whole region, because all the prayers are gathered and they are presented in November in that place where Rose decided to put himself there, where these pagans and heathens and are doing these witchcraft things that we need to civilize out of them.
Is it where those falcons were found?
Falcons?
The soapstone falcons that becomes the Zimbabwe.
That's a different place. That's the Great Zimbabwe Ruins.
Or were they in there?
And what they did with that is the Allen Patrol. There was another battle there, and the BSAC buried their patrol people, again, desecrated the site of Great Zimbabwe, which they called a ruin, but it was a place that people were living in. And they say this is a ruin, and they put, again, it's one of the most sacred sites in Zimbabwe, but they buried their soldiers there. The one I'm talking about is in Matobo, near the border with Botswana. It's huge. This place is 160 square kilometers. It's a massive place. Rocky outcrops. These guys, the reason the war went on for so long when they were invading was because the terrain is so difficult. Even with the guns, and the horses could not go in there, so they had to dismount and go in there and then try and shoot these people out. But anyway, yeah. It's just that with everything is political.
And I just want to add to that for a second, going back to the question. I think there's just something so interesting about the concept of public memory, because you actually do have to ask which public is either being remembered or does the memory serve, and which memories. So, yeah, just to leave it there.
Yeah, I mean, just to pick up on that, for me, everything is political, most certainly. But when you're writing fiction, you're writing about people. And so you've got to be careful about that. So if I write a book set in the Rwandan genocide, is every Hutu a killer? If I write a book set in the Second World War, is every German evil? If I write a book about what's going on in Palestine, it's quite a boring book if the book is Israel is evil, Israelis are nasty racists, and Palestinians are oppressed, and that's the story. I'm not sure it's a fiction that works as a novel, and I don't think it's particularly interesting, because how then are you portraying your characters? Is every single Israeli character going to be flat and hateable? So what I've written is, I hope, a fairly balanced view of people. What fascinates me about the world we live in, now and in the past, and unfortunately probably in the future, is how these atrocities happen when it's ordinary people that are involved. And I still don't understand it. And my mom lived through the bombing of London as a little girl, and she cannot get over her views on the German people. No matter how much I talk to her about it, she'll just say, well, you weren't there, you didn't live through the bombing. And so, you know, obviously I'm sensitive to that and I understand it, but that's her view. And obviously it's not a correct view, but it fascinates me. When I was in Rwanda, I met Tutsis, I met Hutus, who were ordinary people who had lived through one of the most unspeakable acts of violence I think the world has ever seen. And it was perpetrated by nurses and teachers and priests.
Andrew, I read somewhere that most of the people who killed someone killed one or two people.
Yes.
And they usually kill people they knew.
And they killed neighbors, yeah. Now, how do you write a book about that? Yeah,
How many people died?
nearly 1,800,000.
So there were maybe 500,000 people who committed acts of murder,
Yeah.
if those statistics are correct.
Yeah. And, yeah, so it doesn't answer your question, but I'm just throwing it out there that I think it's complex to write fiction about conflict zones, because how do you portray the people who are the actors in it? And why do people get swept up in this madness? But we see it on a daily basis all around the world and in our own country.
And certainly, for me, that's what the Thin Red Line's about. And I actually listened to Hans Zimmer's music when writing some of those battle scenes, trying to sort of get myself into that strange, existentialist, alienated space where... And the Zulu soldiers knew this. They knew that when you went to battle, you were no longer a man, a human person. You went through a whole lot of ceremonies and became some other thing. And after battle, you had to go through whole cleansing ceremonies for weeks before you went back to your homestead, because they understood that when you go into war, you're going to a place that is outside of everyday human existence, and you're into some other strange place that fiction tries to understand.
Well, that brings us to the end of this panel. I want to thank all three authors for really an absolutely incredible discussion. We have a minute or two left. Farai, if you want to close this out with short reading. It's very short, so afterwards go and get the book so you can read the rest.
So I don't write about this particular war, the War of Liberation. It's been written to death. I could have had my take on it, but I did not. But what I did write about is the aftermath, which is actually the topic of this panel, what effect it has on the people who fight it. This is a classroom. The protagonist is 10 years old. They're in primary school and in a government school. This is about mid-80s in Zimbabwe, 5 or so years after independence. The bell rings to end break time, and the other kids rush back into the class before I can move away from Loveness's desk. The protagonist has been trying to chat up a little the new kid in school. The boys start jeering at me, and when Mr. Gumbo storms in, he makes all the boys put their heads on our desks, and he whips us twice each on our backs with a flexible cane he calls bazooka. No one knows Mr. Gumbo's real name. We know it is not Gumbo, because he told us this was his war name. When I unwittingly asked him what a war name was, he made me march up and down the front of the classroom for the whole afternoon. Mr. Gumbo also has a limp. His left leg is shorter and somewhat stiff. It seems not to bend at the knee, and so he dips and drags it as he walks. The story going around among the kids is that he got shot in the leg during the Liberation War, and they put metal pins in it, and that's how he got his name. The story he told us is that he was hit by a grenade, and his leg was flung up into a tree. He climbed up the tree, got his leg, and then pinned it back to his thigh using the pointy end of his AK-47. He then carried on fighting and killing all the Mabunu they were fighting. He told us this story one morning when we were supposed to be learning long division. I preferred the grenade story. He tells so many war stories in class that the parents of some kids have asked the headmaster to move them to a different teacher. He does not stop. The stories aren't so much for us as they are for himself. He will break in the middle of some sentence and start barking out a story. He keeps addressing some unseen comrade as he narrates, his voice getting louder and louder. I am scared sometimes, but never cover my ears. Miss Clark was my teacher before she left in the middle of the term to go to the newly built Rhodes Farm School. Takunda also went to that fancy private school at the same time, along with a whole bunch of other kids. In fact, every morning we see the Rhodes school kids being driven past us while we walk to our council school. When we still had her, Miss Clark did not tell us any war stories, just stories about her grandparents, who she called pioneers, and about them building a lot of stuff in the town. She was mostly concerned with telling us to speak proper English and sit up straight and have good manners. Mr. Gumbo brings down his cane on the last kid and then starts crying, the cane still in his hand. I look up slowly from my desk and a couple of the boys peek up as well. He is hunched over, staring at the floor and convulsing. He weeps and sobs aloud, the way Mukadota sounds on TV when he is pleading with his mistress, Machipisa, not to leave him. It is funny when Mukadota does it, but Mr. Gumbo is not a comedian and my back is stinging. The wailing starts to sound rhythmical. He raises the pitch of his voice and then drops it before trailing off. It sounds like a familiar song, the wailing lament that the ministry has been playing over and over again on radio and TV over the National War Heroes holiday weekend. The other kids still have their heads face down on their desks, glancing sideways at each other. Mr. Gumbo's heavy sobs continue. I slowly raise my head to look at Loveness. She is sitting upright. Her arms are crossed over her chest, and she is staring at the teacher. The dry smell of chalk hangs in the air. None of us are sure what is going on, and our tears are held back by fear and confusion. Loveness scans the room and then meets my gaze. She considers me briefly and then turns up an eyebrow and gestures at the man with the heaving shoulders. I shrug mine. She sighs loudly, then turns to the front again. Attention! Attention! About 10, about 10. The weeping man now jerks upright, shoulders back, barking out and responding to his own commands. All the kids are staring now. He has stopped crying. His face has gone full comrade, and his left hand is held against his brow in salute. He furrows his brow and then switches hands. Pair 2 is seated closest to the teacher's desk. She has had a front row seat to the tears and the heaving. Between the sobs and the salute, she starts screaming. Mr. Gumbo ignores her. He shouts, "Forward, march!" and strides across in front of the blackboard and out of the classroom. Left, right, he yells. He dips and drags his way out of the door and past the windows and out of sight. We hear him break into song. We have defeated you, colonizers, losers. You colonizers, losers. Coming to Zimbabwe, losers. All the way from Britain, losers. All the way from America, losers. All the way from France, losers. Petu is still screaming and a couple of boys start laughing hysterically. The marching song rings down the corridor. The silence in the classroom has been broken. I lean forward towards Loveness. I heard Never say that he has a bullet from the war still stuck in his head. And that's why he acts crazy like this sometimes.
Thank you, everyone.